Hello, everybody. You are listening to Through Time and Clades. My name is Albert,
And I'm Joan.
and it has been a little while since we last uploaded anything or recorded anything for that matter. So, those of you who are longtime followers or regular followers might be wondering what on earth is going on. And so, this episode is basically going to be us telling you all about that, what we've been up to, and what we intend to do with this channel going forward. I guess, would you like to start off and briefly tell us what you've been up to lately?
Sure, yeah. No, you're definitely right about that. We've been taking a little bit of a break, which turned into a sort of mini hiatus, if you will. Um, but on my end, things have been busy and hectic and full of life. Gosh, I've been really thinking a lot about what I want to do with this channel going forward, and talking with you about it, of course. Um, but in between that, just kind of going through the holiday season, which has been which has been an interesting time. The holidays are always interesting, full of good moments, full of some not so good moments. But
Mm-hmm.
I've been doing okay, honestly. How about you?
Yeah, I think things have been reasonably well with me too. It certainly had its up and downs, and there have been several periods of time where I've been extremely busy, and I expect at certain points in the near future to be extremely busy as well. Just yeah, lots to do, but things are going okay.
Absolutely. Um, and of course, we've had some pretty big experiences as well
Hmm.
since we last recorded in, gosh, September. It's been a whole year since we last recorded an episode
Not
of
quite,
the
but
show.
it feels like it. Yeah.
So I guess what we'll be doing first off is kind of talking a little bit more about some specific things that we've been up to, some very relevant things to the channel. You want to go ahead and jump right into that?
Yeah, let's do that.
Right. So here on our next slide, so we very briefly mentioned at the end of our last episode that we were both going to be at the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology 84th annual meeting in Minneapolis, Minnesota, um, which was, gosh, it was such a unique and incredible experience. Albert, why don't you tell us a little bit about what the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology conferences are like, since you've been to far more than I have.
Yeah, like this in many ways is the big event if you are a vertebrate paleontologist or deeply involved with the vertebrate paleontology community. Like this is oftentimes like the big event of the year. So it's an academic meeting um, that is held every year by the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology, which most vertebrate paleontologists are a part of. By and large, it's a way for vertebrate paleontologists to, come together and see old friends and network with each other and establish, working relationships. And also present their own work, like present what type of research they've been up to over the last year or so. Of course, many people who do attend this event are not professional vertebrate paleontologists. So, in addition to professional academics, a lot of people who come to these SVPs, as they're called, uh, are people who might be interested in vertebrate paleontology but aren't actually pursuing a profession in it. Or they might be people who are in some capacity involved professionally with paleontology but are not strictly speaking, say, scientists or researchers like doing research. Like they might be fossil preparators, or people who look for fossils, or people who do outreach programs at museums, things like that. And of course, all these categories of people can get involved with academic research too. It's just what they primarily do versus not. In any case, this is kind of like the central hub if you want to know what's going on in vertebrate paleontology at the moment. It is often the biggest vertebrate paleontology focused conference of each year. Certainly, it's the biggest one that it's probably the biggest one that happens every year, and Last year, it was held in Minneapolis, Minnesota. It is usually held someplace in North America, so either the US or Canada. Although this year, actually, it'll be in the UK, so that'll be interesting. It'll be in Birmingham, if you're wondering. I've been going to SVPs for quite a while now. My first one was in 2015, and that was when I was getting close to the end of my undergraduate degree. So yeah, it was right during the last year of my undergraduate degree. And so last year's SVP, the most recent one, would have been the 10th SVP I've been to, probably, if you include the online ones that happened during the pandemic time. I've become pretty accustomed to attending SVP every year, and they're always fun. They're always quite overwhelming in certain ways, because it's a lot of people, a lot of things going on, and it just goes by in less than a week. Yeah, it's just a ton of information, a ton of experiences. But I know how it goes, like having gone to so many over the years. And so last year, I would say I had fun, and I gave a talk. I usually do at most of these SVPs, and it went well, I think. Certainly no worse than any of my other talks. And I got to see a lot of people I knew, a few people I didn't know previously, but mostly got to mingle with people I knew. But honestly, I think the biggest thing for me, or at least the most novel experience for me last year, was finally getting to meet you in person, which is a pretty big deal because we've known each other for a very long time on the internet, but we never had the chance to actually meet in person. So I think that might be the most memorable experience that I had last year. But I do know it was your first SVP ever. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how that went?
Oh, absolutely. No, you're right about that. Yeah, as funny as it seems, the first official meeting of the Through Time and Clades crew was at SVP, and
Mm-hmm.
it was actually really funny. We kind of got lost in well, I kind of got lost in the airport a little bit trying to find you. Um, but no, gosh, it was such a unique experience. The way that I would describe it to my friends who were there, who I also met in person for the first time, that's a whole story I could get into. Um, it was exciting, it was anxiety inducing, and it was exhausting.
Mm.
Um, it was exciting because, of course, all this brand new stuff. I'm seeing these paleontologists for the first time that I've read about or seen in documentaries or talked to online in interviews, and seeing all this brand new research. A lot of it, embargoed, um, and not to mention all the art stalls and talking with the community and just chatting with everybody. That was really fun, and it was very convenient too because Minneapolis was relatively chilly, so the hotel and the convention center were like the same building. So we didn't have to worry about like going through the snow to go to the convention center. It was all there.
Right.
Of course, it was anxiety inducing in that I was meeting a lot of these paleontologists for the first time. And I had to remind myself that we are all essentially colleagues in a sense. So, it's not like I'm, going to Comic Con and seeing, Chris Hemsworth or something, being like, oh my God, they're just, we're all just regular people who are just interested in vertebrate paleontology. And so I kind of had to remind myself that, but also, try to take a good first impression, which I hope and think that I did. And of course, it was exhausting because there was just so much. The way that the convention is run is that from like morning to afternoon, it was like 7 or 8 in the morning is when the first lectures would start, and then they would be in chunks based upon either topics in vertebrate paleontology or specific clades of organisms. So like there were like 2 theropod sessions. There was like an ungulate session. There was a session for like proto-mammalian synapsids. Um, and there would be like 3 different sessions going on at the exact same time. So if there
Mm-hmm.
were specific talks or specific groups that you wanted to see, you had to like coordinate which ones to go to. And there was a lot of people jumping back and forth between
Yeah.
individual talks which I kind of had to like read the room to figure out like how to do it respectfully because when I first heard about this, I'm like, oh my God, if I want to see another session, I don't want to like walk out while somebody's talking. But no, it's all structured, it's that's just proper etiquette. So that all worked out. But of course, then it's like, how do you choose? Ooh, there's a talk on whale evolution going on right at the same time at this talk about a new species of like a bird, a fossil bird. And it's like, which one do I go to? So there's a lot of juggling going on, and I think like halfway through, like I was just less and less interested in trying to catch every single talk that I could and just try to enjoy myself and the community. Um, so that involved hanging out in the poster area, which was also where the stalls were, the displays, where I had supported some of the local artists there, bought a lot of prints, and chatted with some people who I had heard about, and also some new people that I was meeting. Getting to meet Danny and Duza of paleontologizing was really fun. I got to chat with like Beth Zeiken, the paleo artist who we featured on our ancient Greenland DNA study. She was really great. Getting to see Dr. Holtz in person, that was really fun. Hearing him give his poster talk. Just all around excellent. And of course, catching up with Albert was really great. We were roommates in the hotel, which was really fun and made things really convenient. Because of course, I'm not a member of the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology. So the reason I was able to go there was because for a small fee, a member can invite a guest along. And so Albert was very gracious to ask, like, hey, do you want to be a guest with me and come to this SVP? It's relatively close to where you are. And like that entire process was very smooth. And I'm very grateful to have had the opportunity to go. And gosh, I would absolutely do it again if the stars were aligned in the right way. But definitely for a non-paleontologist with a huge interest in the field anyway, it was a very welcoming and wonderful experience, and I couldn't have had it any better way, I think. And so I think that's about my experiences with the SVB meeting. And I'm definitely excited for the next one whenever I get the opportunity.
I'm really glad to hear that.
And so I understand that you've also been pretty busy with some other exciting projects. I'd love to hear about them.
Yeah, I've definitely been up to a number of things, both before and after SVP. And some of these projects were nice enough that they came out since we last recorded, and so I can actually talk about them in public. And so I guess the first thing I'll mention is the one pictured on the slide here on the right. So this is a new poster, not drawn or designed by me, but one that I was a scientific consultant on. This is a poster depicting the evolution and phylogenetic relationships of a selection of dinosaurs, and also a number of other extinct and actually a few living reptiles as well. And so this poster, which if you are familiar with their work, you might be able to recognize from the kind of design and art style alone, is by the German educational studio Kurzgesagt, which is mainly known for their YouTube channel. However, they also release various like physical products such as posters and calendars. And so this was one of the products that they released recently towards the end of last year. And I had worked with Kurzgesagt before on various projects as a consultant, which you might recall if you're a long-time listener of ours. And it had been, I think, a couple of years since I last heard from them, but over, I think it was last summer, they reached out to me again, was like, hey, we are interested in doing a poster looking at the phylogeny of dinosaurs specifically, because previously they released a similar poster looking at the phylogeny across like the entire tree of life. But they want to do one specifically on dinosaurs because they like dinosaurs and they know a lot of people like dinosaurs. And so I was like, oh yeah, it would be great because he did a really great job with the Tree of Life poster. I'd be happy to help you with this one. We exchanged a number of emails, even had a video call where I kind of listened to what they were going for and gave them suggestions as they kind of refined the concept for this poster. And in the end, they came out with this. I'm pretty happy with what they came up with. In working on these projects, like in any capacity, there's always some trade-offs or like hard decisions you have to make about what to include, what not to include, what information should be there and what shouldn't. And overall, I think in the end they hit upon a very nice sweet spot when it comes to like all of those things. They struck a very good balance, and so I would say I'm pretty happy with this poster. And if you want one of your own, you can go on their website and order a physical copy. So I think that's definitely one of the most exciting projects I was working on over last year. Something else that came out last year that I worked on was an encyclopedia article, interestingly. This article is intended to be published in the second edition of the Encyclopedia of Evolutionary Biology. And so previously, a version of this article had been published in 2016 in an earlier edition of this encyclopedia, but the main author on the earlier edition is not as actively involved with scientific research anymore. He was like quite a productive researcher, publishing a lot of papers on bird evolution throughout the 2000s. And so he approached my supervisor and asked whether he'd want to help him write, or at least update, the article for the second edition. And so this article is about the origin and evolution of birds, basically. And having received this invitation, my supervisor then went on to ask me, and I said yes. So essentially, I ended up writing kind of the main bulk of the article using the previous version as a basis and just adding in the new information and references as appropriate. The physical encyclopedia itself has not come out yet. It will be published supposedly at some point this year, and the article will be in it. But they've already released the article as a online kind of version. If you want to check it out, you can, and I'll definitely leave a link to that in the description below. And if you need help getting a copy of the article, because it might be for you behind a paywall, so they might ask you to pay money to see it. Well, drop us a line or something. We always give our contact information at the end of each episode. So if you need help accessing my papers or anything, give us a call and we can see if we can hook you up with that. In any case, very nice little project to be involved in, as you can probably tell from the fact that I work on this show, and especially from my series, Dinosaurs the Second Chapter, which is all about this topic. I always enjoy kind of summarizing the latest knowledge about bird evolution and kind of the various subfields within it. And so to be able to do that as a kind of published encyclopedia article was really, really quite something. And that was fun to have out there as well. Do you have anything to add?
Oh, I'm definitely excited about the encyclopedia article. That's so cool. I have always wanted to contribute to a project like that. So it's very exciting that you got that opportunity. And gosh, yeah, Kurzgesagt with their products. I quite like their posters. I have their map of evolution still on my wall, and I quite enjoy that. So seeing that format extended for dinosaurs and other related reptiles is really cool to see. I love the designs. I love the layout. I love the coverage too. They got a good sampling of species. I just recently got their human era calendar for 2025, or should I say 12,025, which is all about the human population expansions around the world and kind of when people started, first stepping foot on different continents. And it's gorgeous. It's always fun to look at that. And I love their calendars. So it's nice that you've been able to keep in touch with them and work on these projects. I definitely hope to get a copy of the dinosaur poster soon myself. Yeah, so let's move on. We have a lot of follow-up and shout-outs to catch up on. So let's move to the next slide. And so the last time we recorded, we were talking about a recent BBC series called Asia. And we had gotten press releases, but no trailers or nothing about release dates. Well, since we last spoke, that series has, of course, premiered. That was actually on November 3rd. And if you subscribe or have the BBC iPlayer, well, then you got basically the entire series because they dropped all the episodes at once on that date for the iPlayer, which is pretty exciting. So just to be clear, so I caught up with the series. I've seen the entire thing. You, my friend, have only seen the first episode still?
Yeah, despite having access to BBC iPlayer, yes.
Right. So I'll try to not spoil too much about it. But for those interested, so of course this did turn out to be a seven-part series, ending with an episode of conservation stories. Um, Instead of going region by region like the predecessor series Africa had done, these episodes were grouped by habitat in a very interesting way. So like waterways got their own episode, forests got their own episode, deserts and polar regions. So it was very much the traditional BBC Earth franchise format this time around, which was no less exciting. It was very beautifully done, and I think it's safe to say for sure that this was indeed a worthy successor to the Africa format. They had a bunch of great footage and a lot of behaviors and species that were unique and different for a show like this. Um, just a few personal highlights I want to mention without giving away too much of the show. Um, there was a chase sequence between Moorish idol fish, which are like kind of angelfish looking reef fish,
Mhm.
but they're not related, and reef sharks. And it was just intense. The sharks would chase the fish off the reef, and it was just this nonstop chase of this little school of Moorish idols with this huge, school of sharks. Um, and I was on the edge of my seat the entire time.
Mhm.
Um, there was a lot of rare footage of very endangered species. We got to see goby bears and Persian leopards, which, good luck seeing those in typical nature documentaries. They were able to get footage of them foraging and feeding and with their young, with, of course, camera traps, um, of very nice quality. Very beautiful animals, both of them. And as well, there's a sequence with the mating of purple frogs. Now, the purple frogs are kind of fascinating to me because they're relatively newly discovered animals.
Mhm.
I know the juveniles had actually been identified before the adults, long ago, but the adult forms had only been found in 2003. Um, so they're kind of new in that sense. And so to see footage of them included in a nature documentary alongside other, long familiar animals is always a treat. Kind of reminds me of like what Dorling Kendersley has been doing with their encyclopedias when they update it every decade or so. They'll put in a bunch of new species of animals that were discovered within that time period to get them kind of more familiar to the general public who might purchase those tomes. So to see a series like this do the sort of the same thing is a real treat. Um, and the conservation episode I think was well done too. They're definitely making a conscious effort to talk about conservation stories that benefit both wildlife and people, because I think that that's the most logical and fair way going forward. And I really liked a sequence with the Javan green magpie,
Mhm.
where there was a conservationist, Panji Gusti Akbar, who was behind the Chingana Wildlife Center in Java, uh, to protect these birds, which are very critically endangered, and kind of working with local communities who had this tradition of capturing birds from the wild and having these singing contests with the birds, and kind of helping convince one of the locals to donate their green magpie to their conservation center, and also kind of steer them away from taking the birds from the wild to appreciating them in a natural setting and making a living in that way. Um, which that's such a beautiful story. It's very
Mhm.
it's so nice to see this sort of thing, and so overall, I was very pleased with Asia. The only critique I had, and some of you watching might notice from this poster here for the show. This is an official poster from the show. That is an AI tiger. That is not a photograph of a tiger. That is an AI
Mhm.
art image that was used for the show. And on top of that, like all of the like preview episode images
Yeah.
were AI creations, um, which is kind of surprising and a little bit shocking to be honest. Given what we know about kind of the role that AI production has as a carbon emitter, alongside the issues of copyright and other things. That's not a good look for the BBC.
Yeah.
I don't know who was in charge of that, but I don't like seeing it, and I hope that they don't continue doing that in the near future. Um, I don't understand what could be difficult about just getting screenshots from their episodes and just using those. It, I don't know, maybe they wanted it to be more cinematic, as if the show wasn't already cinematic enough. I don't know. Um, but yeah, shame on you, BBC. We don't like that. Um, but overall, like the series itself is great, and I'm very happy that it's aired. Um, and on top of that, we've been finally getting some more info, including trailers for, I guess you can call it like the next iteration in this geographical series
Hmm.
for the BBC. So this is the Americas. Now, this is going to air on February the 23rd on NBC in America. But it will, of course, come to BBC One and iPlayer. I think very recently they were able to secure that deal. Um, this is not a David Attenborough series. This is going to be narrated by Tom Hanks, but it's very much of this same scope. Um, it's a 10-part series. It's going to cover both North and South America. And unlike Asia, but like Africa, we're actually getting it organized by region this time around. So, as well as the familiar, Amazon rainforest and the American West and the Arctic, we're actually going to get entire whole episodes about Patagonia, the
Hmm.
Caribbean, Mexico, and the Gulf Coast,
Wow.
which I haven't really seen a lot, get big highlights like that in shows like this, let
Hmm.
alone entire hour-long episodes. Um, and of course, they're also promising the same unique species, unique behaviors, a well-rounded hemispheric scope. Um, so I'm definitely excited about this, and I can't wait to see it when it comes out, um, and kind of see what kind of news stories we can tell from the Western Hemisphere. Um, so yeah, already off the bat, we're getting some very good content from the BBC, and as always, we'll continue to highlight shows that we've seen or upcoming shows to kind of get the word out as much as we can. Did you have anything you'd like to add, buddy?
Yeah, even though I haven't seen much of Asia besides the first episode, I do agree with your general kind of verdict so far. The sequences are like very cinematic, often very surprising, and they definitely seem to have kind of a good spread of focus on like different types of organisms. Like there are some that might have been featured quite prominently in previous documentaries, and also many others that will be unfamiliar to most people. And the Moorish idol sequence that you mentioned earlier was in the first episode, so I have seen that one, and I agree. Like that was incredible. I'd never seen anything like it. One thing I will mention that's kind of interesting to me personally is that when the press release for Asia came out, or at least one of the press releases I was reading, they mentioned that they had filmed in Taiwan. And my family is from Taiwan, as you probably know. So I was interested to see, oh, what kind of Taiwanese wildlife did they film? And I was very surprised to learn. I haven't seen like the full episode like this segment is a part of, but I have seen like kind of follow up promotions talking about it. I was very surprised to learn that they had filmed red giant flying squirrels in the middle of like Taipei City, basically. And it's like, whoa, that's crazy because my family lives in Taipei City. Like, I lived there before. I regularly visit on the holidays. And I've never seen a wild red giant flying squirrel. I had no idea you could find them in the middle of the urban environment there. Like, I knew Taiwan had flying squirrels, but they always seemed to me like animals you'd have to go up into the mountains at night to be able to see. But no, apparently some flying squirrels had set up like dwellings, their nests, in a local elementary school in Taipei City, and they do travel every night from the schools into the mountains that kind of surround the city. But yeah, they live there, and if you're there at the right time of the night, then you have a chance of seeing them like gliding through like skyscrapers and such, which is wild. And I did watch like the little segment that was available for that clip. I would not have expected that to be what they would have featured from Taiwan. I know they also did another segment in Taiwan, at least one other segment, which was looking at hornets and hornets being preyed upon by honey buzzards, which is also really cool. Yeah, very very strange type of bird of prey, which again. I was aware that these animals could be found in Taiwan, but they would not be what I would immediately think of when I think of Taiwanese wildlife. So it's really cool. It's really cool to see Taiwanese wildlife getting some like mainstream documentary airtime. And lastly, I would like to say, yeah, like I'm glad you mentioned the AI art thing because, or I should say AI imagery thing, because yeah, that surprised me too. And what surprises me perhaps even more is I haven't seen anyone else talking about this, which is very odd because certainly a lot of the artists I know are typically very critical of the use of AI imagery for I think very good reasons. And yet I haven't really seen anyone else in my circle talking about the fact that BBC has been using AI imagery to promote their series. And like you, I don't really understand why they went with this decision because, like you said, they were spoiled for choice when it comes to like images from the actual series they could have used for their cover. Like they could have taken like any of the spectacular kind of shots that they used from the series itself and use that as a cover, which is generally what they kind of have done for their previous series. So I do not know why they made this decision. It's just bizarre. Yeah, there's a lot that could be said about the ethics of AI imagery, but like generative AI in general. But I do not want to dwell on that here, so I'll try to move on. As for the Americas, I know even less about than I do about the Asia series, but from what you explained, it sounds very exciting indeed. And yeah, I'm sure this one will probably turn out pretty great as well. So yes, I'm definitely excited to catch up with these series when I can.
Absolutely. So let's move on then. I want to give a little bit of a shout out to a favorite place of mine. Now, you might be forgiven for thinking that the age of the Cabinet of Curiosities style museum was a thing of the past, and that all the natural history museums on the world have been totally revamped for modern times. That's not the case at the L.C. Bates Museum in Hinckley, Maine, in the U.S. At the turn of the 20th century, following this massive fire that destroyed the original museum collection, the then president of the Paris Manufacturing Company, that's in Paris, Maine, Louis C. Bates had helped kickstart the conversion of this building here on the left, the Quincy Manual Training Building, into a museum of nature and local history, or the campus of Goodwill Hinckley, which is a boarding and training school for orphans and other underprivileged youth, which is a fascinating story in its own right. Well, today that building is very much kept as it stood from its original foundations in 1903. Like you look at that photo here. This is an old like archival photo. It still looks exactly like that. And when you walk inside, you may as well have gone back in time. I've been visiting the L.C. Bates Museum for as long as I've been visiting my dad's side of the family in Maine, which is a long time. And, save for some rotating local art galleries and some additional specimens, the interior exhibits have remained the same. And I've always really loved it for that. The museum is divided into several halls and exhibition areas that are practically filled to the brim with taxidermy animals and shells and rocks and minerals and fossils and historical artifacts from Asia and the Americas and dioramas and preserved plants and then some. I have some of my photos that I've taken from my travels on the right here. There's an ocean hall which features a giant blue marlin that was caught by Ernest Hemingway.
Wow.
There's a hall of wildlife which features mammals and reptiles, including a now extinct caribou that used to be found in the state. There's a mineral room with samples of all of the major mineral groups. And one of my personal favorites is the bird hall, which includes a near complete sampling of Maine's avifauna, as well as specimens spanning the globe that they always seem to be adding to every time I come here. They got a cassowary, they got a shoebill head, they got a lammergeier, and they even have a passenger pigeon.
Hmm.
Um, it's remarkable, and I could easily get lost in there and spend hours just admiring all the individual specimens that they've been well cared for and maintained in all this time. In fact, Ernest Hemingway's Marlin has actually gone through renovations to fix the then peeling skin that it used to have,
Hmm.
and so it looks about as good as the day that it was brought to the museum. And of course, I have a little exhibit about Ernest Hemingway himself and how the Marlin got there to begin with that I'll save for you to visit. Now, if you'd like to visit, so they are open in the summer from Wednesdays to Saturdays, 10 a.m. to 4:30, and in the winter from 9 a.m. to 4:30. Or if you want a special appointment, you can just call their number, and they'll squeeze you in somehow. So that's at 14 Eastler Road, Hinckley, Maine. I have a link to the official website in the description if you want to look more into it and learn more about the history. Because of course support for the museum is always appreciated. It doesn't cost much to get in, and donations are always welcome. They have a gift shop if you want to support in that way, and they do tours. They have special exhibits that they'll do personal tours for as well. There's some extinct butterflies that I always like to go see whenever I visit. That they have them in a cabinet, and I personally would want to help ensure that the museum remains a special historic landmark and an educational center for years to come. So if you're in the area or if you're looking for unique places to go travel to, I can't recommend this museum enough. L.C. Bates Museum in Maine. Just got to check it out.
Hmm.
Do you have anything you'd like to add?
Well, I've never been, but if I'm in the area, I'll definitely keep it in mind. It's a kind of cabinet of curiosities style of display, which definitely has a certain charm to it. It does remind me a little bit of a small museum we have here in the UK. In London, we have a museum called the Grant Museum of Zoology, which is like it's a small museum, but it's got like cabinets just full of like all kinds of animal specimens, and you could like spend all day there just staring hours and hours through the cabinets and looking at everything, like from floor to ceiling. It definitely sounds like a really wonderful collection.
Every time I've gone to Maine, I always bring somebody who hasn't been, so or hasn't been in a long time.
Mm.
So a lot of my aunts and uncles, they may have gone when they were younger, but not recently. So it's a wonderful experience. Um, so yeah, we'll move on from there now to the next slide. We do have some follow up from previous episodes. As you can see from the slide, the story of the dingo just keeps growing. I wanted to highlight two recent papers from the past few months, so since during our hiatus time, that add some more details and clarifications to the natural history of this unique canine, if you will. So the first is from Lucas G. Kungoulos and colleagues from September of 2024, who wanted to explore the skeletal morphology of ancient dingoes to see if there could be any physical links made with non-Australian dogs, as the leading model for the origin of the dingo, if you may remember from our previous coverage, is that they ultimately descended from East Asian varieties that traveled with humans down Southeast Asia and crossed into Australia by boat. So to do this, the team performed what they call a 3D geometric morphometric analysis, which basically means taking three-dimensional scans of dingo skulls, which were uncovered from 3,000-year-old remains, and you place special markers on homologous parts of the bone. And then you compare them all through statistics, which can often be a more objective approach than taking direct measurements by hand, which the team also did for extra measure. In the end, they were able to further confirm a link between dingoes and the dogs of East Asia and New Guinea, but they also showed that the skull shape was quite different from dingoes alive today. It's smaller in size and in dentition, but more like the non-Australian types. So this seems to indicate that as dingoes spread across Australia, they adapted and changed their bodies to the new environments. In fact, as had long been suspected by earlier studies, it seems that dingoes have formed a northwestern southeastern cline right across the continent. That is to say that as you move in that direction, the morphology changes over that distance. And the morphometric studies indicate that in the former regions, the dingoes have retained more of those smaller ancestral characters than those in the latter northwest region. So that's really cool. Now, the authors noted that these results may have been affected somewhat by the possibility that there was hybridization between these wild southeastern dingoes and often smaller domestic dogs that would have caused some of those morphological changes. But if we look at our second study by Andrew R. Weeks and colleagues from October of 2024, it may render that objection moot. So domestic dogs were indeed introduced into Australia in 1788. That's under the establishment of the colony of New South Wales. And it had long been questioned whether they interbred with the dingoes who had been there for many thousands of years prior. That's something that certainly happens in captive settings. We have evidence of that. So why not in the wild? So to test this, the team sampled the genomes of over 430 wild and captive dingoes from all over the continent, as well as other types of canines like wolves and jackals. And they checked for signals of introgression between all of these. So the hybridization trees are shown here at the bottom right, and they indicate that there was plenty of interbreeding between, say, wolves and village dogs and jackals and domestic dogs and captive dingoes, but there was none whatsoever between the wild dingoes and domestic dogs. There is no characteristic breakdown of DNA that should be expected, nor do the results vary when the dingoes are sampled as a whole or when they're placed into regional groups. As far as can be told from this current data set, in the absence of newer studies, wild dingoes seem to have remained their own unique population, away from their very distant domesticated relatives, which is just fascinating to think about. Now, of course, as always, the story of the dingo has become a bit of a classic tale for Through Time and Clade. So you can certainly look forward to newer developments as we continue this series. But I thought these were really fascinating papers. What do you think, buddy?
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. It is really exciting to see so many studies coming out in recent times, kind of refining our picture of how the dingo originated. It is such a curious kind of case. And yeah, I am pretty surprised by that study suggesting that there isn't evidence of recent hybridization. I definitely would not have expected that. I'm always interested in hearing more about this story.
Absolutely. And speaking of stories, so and I guess we can talk a little bit about this now, if you like.
Yeah, sure.
We have been looking at our previous format of these monthly news episodes, or sometimes bi-monthly news episodes, where we pick a selection of stories from goodness knows so many that are equally fascinating and share them with you all on here. Well, we've been thinking that model has kind of been, for lack of a better word, kind of stagnant. And we've really been looking into trying to make more content that is focused and also somewhat shorter, to ease ourselves and perhaps some of our viewers who may not have the time to spend an hour or two or more listening to us talk about the natural world. But that being said, it's hard not to talk about studies that fascinate us, and there's quite a few that have really caught our attention. So what we're going to do, at least for today, is we have each of us picked 5 papers, either from the past year or within the past months during our hiatus. And we'll kind of briefly go over, our thoughts and the ones that we thought were the most fascinating. So if we go to the next slide, Albert, I believe you have the floor first, and you've decided to pick some papers from all of 2024 in relevance to bird origins and evolution. So why don't you take the floor for us?
Sure, I can do that. So yes, I guess to kind of add on my perspective to what you were discussing regarding reflecting on the format of our show, I think having taken so much time away from the show recently, we've definitely both had certain thoughts about how we should continue the show moving forward. And for me, I think I really enjoy doing the show. I enjoy talking to you, and I enjoy, sharing all this information with our audience. But doing the show does take quite a bit of time and effort on my part, not only preparing the individual episodes, but also editing them afterward. And I guess if those of you listening weren't aware, I do most of the video and recording editing. Well, yeah, I do most of the video and recording editing for our show. I know, like, Joan, you've edited a few episodes, and especially the ones that you do by yourself are all done by you. But the vast majority of the editing is done by me, and I am happy to continue doing that. But it does take me a long time to go through all of our recordings. It has kind of been increasingly apparent to me that I have other things I'd like to do too. So obviously I have a job, and believe it or not, I do have other hobbies, which I would like to make time for. If we kind of make episodes at the rate that we've been doing when we were active, I suspect that I wouldn't have as much time to do those other things as I would like. Kind of related to that are these kind of yearly updates I've been doing for the series Dinosaurs, the Second Chapter. And I know you've already kind of retired doing updates for your series Humanity, a Prologue, and instead kind of retooled that into a season 2. And yeah, for me, I also think that the update specials for Dinosaurs, the Second Chapter require a kind of immense amount of time and effort invested. And I'm not sure I would be able to continue doing that at a regular pace. And so, as a kind of send-off to that format, what I decided to do in this episode is to briefly cover kind of 5 of my favorite stories on basically the topic of bird evolution and bird paleontology that came out during 2024. So these are 5 stories that I would have really liked to talk about if I were to make another Dinosaurs the Second Chapter update, but I probably won't make that update, and therefore you're going to get those stories here. And of course, I did have to narrow down my scope to only 5 stories, so if I don't talk about like your favorite bird evolution story, then I apologize in advance. But I think the 5 I picked were, to me, pretty exciting ones. So let's jump into those. 3 of them, or at least kind of figures from 3 of them, are pictured on this slide here. And so we'll start with the one on the left. So this was a new major study on bird phylogenomics, so trying to figure out the phylogenetic relationships of birds through kind of large-scale genetic data by Stiller et al. 2024. Now, we've had a number of similar studies to this come out over the last decade or so, but as you probably know, if you've heard me talk about this topic, whether in Dinosaurs the Second Chapter or elsewhere, there's still a lot in bird phylogeny that is strongly debated. Like, there's, in some cases, essentially no consensus about where certain groups of birds go in the kind of evolutionary tree compared to the others. Well, I think this study represents a really major step forward in that regard. So in this study, Stiller et al. Sequenced over 300 bird genomes and used those to kind of create a best possible estimate of kind of the bird family tree, as well as the time scale on which birds evolved. And what they found was in many ways consistent with what a lot of other recent phylogenetic studies found, where they found modern birds probably had an origin somewhere in the middle Cretaceous, but the majority of modern lineages, mainly in the group Neo-Aves, which includes 95% of living birds, probably radiated kind of explosively. Like nearly all the major lineages in this group probably originated sometime around or shortly after the end Cretaceous boundary, and this is very consistent with what previous studies have found. Furthermore, they were able to clarify the relationships within Neo-Aves quite a bit. They found strong support for certain relationships that had previously been controversial or had perhaps not even been discovered by previous studies before. And so I would say that this is not the definitive last word on bird phylogeny, but I think this is probably the closest we've gone so far, and it might be the closest we've gotten to actually solving the problem of neo-avian phylogeny, which some people have speculated could not be done, basically. So it's really exciting. Something they highlight is that they really needed to sequence like all these genomes to be able to find strong support for some of these relationships, which really suggests that, this is basically a difficult problem to solve that requires a lot of computing power and a lot of data, which explains why previous studies have not been able to find some of these results. So that's pretty cool. So basically, if you want the latest on bird phylogeny, I think following this study is a pretty safe bet. Like, I'm not going to say it's 100% accurate because we can never be sure about that, and I'm sure future studies will have things to say. But I think if you wanted to pick just one study to follow when it comes to bird phylogeny, this is the one for now. On the right here, we have pictured two kind of somewhat related studies in a way, and these two have more to do with fossil birds and specifically specific types of fossil birds. So on the top right here, we see a fossil skull of a type of large extinct flightless bird called a gastornithid. And gastornithids were these really large flightless birds that lived during the early Paleogene period, so during the Paleocene and Eocene epochs, between about 60 to 45 million years ago. Gastornithids had these massive beaks, and if you grew up kind of reading books of a certain age about prehistoric life, there are two things you probably know have changed about gastornithids in kind of relatively recent decades. And one is that it used to be thought that they were primarily meat eaters, and so very memorably in the BBC documentary Walking with Beasts, it was said that the ecosystems and time periods when gastornithids were around could be described as a time when birds ate horses. So they were shown eating these early kind of stem group horses in that documentary, and also commonly in paleo art. More recently, we have come to a consensus that the anatomy and also other lines of evidence such as biochemistry from the fossils suggest that gastornithids were mostly herbivorous birds, so they probably weren't going around hunting little horses on a regular basis. Still pretty scary animals to encounter, probably, if you were to kind of meet one in real life. Because these things, the really biggest ones, they were comparable in size to an ostrich. And something else that has changed about gastornithids is that some of them used to be classified in the genus Diatryma. And so if you've read books of a certain age, you're probably familiar with the name Diatryma. But over the years, taxonomic revisions have kind of lumped all of the gastornithid genera into a single genus, Gastornis, which was the earliest one named. And so in the last 20 years or so, probably, all gastornithids were classified in the genus Gastornis, and the genus Diatryma was not used anymore. However, in a new study by Meyer et al., they examined many specimens of gastornithids, mostly from Germany, and in some cases these were specimens that people hadn't looked at in a long time. In some cases they were kind of newly identified specimens, and they proposed that it is actually possible to distinguish the species that used to be in Diatryma versus the ones that the name Gastornis was based on. And therefore, these authors suggest that Diatryma and Gastornis should be considered two separate genera again, and so Diatryma is back. And so Diatryma now includes species from both Europe and North America, whereas the genus Gastornis currently, according to these authors, only includes species from Europe. And in a related note, on the bottom right here, we have a new study looking at the skull of another giant flightless extinct bird called Genyornis. Genyornis was found in Australia, and unlike Diatryma and Gastornis, it actually lived recent enough in the Pleistocene to have encountered humans. And indeed, there's an argument to be made that it might have gone extinct because of human activity, although that is highly controversial. In any case, we've known about the skull of Genyornis for quite a while, but they hadn't really been anatomically described in the scientific literature in very much detail. And so in a new, very long and comprehensive study, it's over 70 pages long, Genyornis et al. Decided to kind of look at least, they looked at 6 specimens of Genyornis with preserved skull material and did this really detailed description of what its skull anatomy was like. And you can see like one of these nearly complete skull specimens pictured in the figure here. Now, even though it is nearly complete, it is a little bit distorted by the preservation process, so it might not look very much like a skull to you. But in any case, the tip of the beak is pointing right in most of these images, except for the one in the middle, where you're viewing it from the back. And the back of the skull is mostly pointing to the left in these images. And so they found some pretty interesting things. First of all, in recent years it had been suggested by various studies that Genyornis and other Australian flightless birds like it, which together are called the Genyornithids, or the demon ducks of doom, were closely related to things like Diatryma and Gastornis. And indeed, both of these groups seem to belong to the group Galloanserae, so they're related to like both the chicken lineage and duck lineage of birds. However, this detailed redescription of the skull of Genyornis by McInerney et al. Argued that Dromonithids were not, in fact, closely related to gastornithids. Now, what gastornithids were closely related to is still kind of open to debate, but in terms of what dromonithids were closely related to, these authors suggest that they might be most closely related to a group of weird South American waterfowl called the screamers. And we've talked about screamers before in Dinosaurs, the second chapter. They are waterfowl, so they're closely related to ducks, but they don't look very much like ducks. They look a bit like, I guess, tall chickens, you could say. So they're very strange. And this actually is not a completely new idea. Like back in the day, some people had actually suggested that dromonithids were most closely related to screamers. But this idea also kind of fell out of favor in recent years, and it's with this new study that they kind of brought back that idea and were able to kind of collect a lot of new evidence to support it. So that's really interesting. I think this will be a very, very helpful paper for those of us who really want to figure out exactly how all these weird extinct birds are related. And so I definitely will be referencing it a lot in my own research going forward. Going on to the next slide to cover my last two studies that I want to spotlight here. I started with the left again. So this is a study on another extinct bird called Vanellus madagascariensis. So this is an extinct type of lapwing, which in turn are a kind of plover. So they're little shorebirds that mostly hang around near water, though not always. They can be found in kind of open habitats all over the world. And something interesting about lapwing plovers specifically is that many of them have this spike, like kind of grows out of their wing, which is kind of wicked. So on the top of the figure here, you can see the wing bone of a modern lapwing, and you can see that out of the leading edge of that wing bone, there's a big spike growing from it. And so this spike it's not a claw. It's literally like if you had a bony spike growing out of the edge of your hand, essentially. So it's not modified from like the claw on the tip of the finger. So it's actually growing out of basically the base of the palm or the wrist area of the wing. In life, this spike, or spur as we call it, is covered in keratin that makes it even longer, and so it forms a very nice kind of solid, sharp point on the wing. And what lapwing plovers that are living today will do is that they use this wing spur to defend their nests from predators. In Australia, there's a species called the masked plover, which is kind of infamous for doing this. So if you're in Australia, there are a number of types of bird species that are infamous and notorious for swooping at people during the breeding season, and masked lapwings are one of them. So they will swoop at people and try to like scare you into thinking that they're going to hit you with their wing spurs, and sometimes they actually do hit you with their wing spurs, which I'm sure hurts a lot. And so the authors of a new study looked at the wing spur in a recently extinct type of lapwing from Madagascar. So this is Vanellus madagascariensis. And Vanellus madagascariensis probably went extinct less than 5,000 years ago. So this is also a very recently extinct animal that probably encountered the first humans to arrive in Madagascar. And what's really striking about the wing spur in this lapwing, this extinct lapwing, is that it is much bigger than the spur of any modern lapwing. And the truth is, like, Vanellus madagascariensis was about as big as the biggest lapwings we have today, which would be like the masked lapwing of Australia. And yet, even compared to the masked lapwing, its spur was massive. And we don't know for sure what this spur was used for, but it is very plausible that it was using them in a similar way to defend against predators. And like, I don't know about you, but I wouldn't want to be any of these Malagasy predators who had to put up with like a defensive like, lapwing parent. Now, I guess in terms of what types of predators it might have been defending against, Madagascar does have things like large snakes and birds of prey that potentially would have been a threat to these lapwings. In addition, it also has a number of mongoose-like carnivorous mammals, such as the fossa, which again potentially would have been interested in catching lapwing chicks. And so maybe it makes sense for like this Madagascar lapwing to have like this massive wing spur to help defend against these predators. And finally, the last study I'll spotlight here is about the phylogeny of a group of birds called accipitrids. This is a group of birds of prey. So this is a group of birds of prey that includes everything that we call a hawk or an eagle, and also vultures that are found in Africa and Eurasia, but not vultures that are found in the Americas. So the American vultures, such as condors, are not members of the accipitrid group, but the Afro-Eurasian ones are. It's also a group of birds where there's been a lot of convergent evolution going on, and it has been quite difficult to do a comprehensive study looking at their phylogenetic relationships. And so up until recently, I would say, we had maybe the broad strokes of accipitrid phylogeny down, but many of the specifics we still weren't really sure about. Well, in a new study that was published last year, the authors of the study kind of did like the most comprehensive analysis yet of the accipitrid family tree, and were able to give us like kind of a better and much clearer look at the phylogeny of the accipitrids. And probably the most notable problem that they solved was the relationships of these hawks that we generally call accipiters in like birding terminology, and they're named after the genus Accipiter. So these are hawks are mostly like relatively small, although some of them can get decently sized, and they tend to have relatively short wings and long tails. And what they tend to do is that they mostly hunt other types of birds. So what they're really good at is they're good at like flying really quickly and very agilely, so they can maneuver in very tight spaces, such as inside forests. They can like weave back and forth through the trees when they're chasing after these other birds, and they're found pretty much all over the world. And so it used to be that all of these quote-unquote accipiter hawks were classified in the genus Accipiter, but we have actually known for a while, in fact I believe we covered this on Dinosaurs the Second Chapter, that some kind of preliminary genetic studies had shown that some of these accipiter hawks are actually more closely related to certain types of hawks that we wouldn't call accipiters than to other quote-unquote accipiter hawks. Some of them are more closely related to a group of hawks called the harriers, and the harriers are very different in like their overall body shape and behavior to your typical accipiter. In many ways, it couldn't be more different, because instead of like flying very quickly through the trees, they like to spend time in open habitats, and they fly low and slowly over the ground, like very close to the ground, usually in places where there's lots of tall grass, and then they kind of watch and listen for their prey before like pouncing down from the air. So they mostly catch things like little mammals and such. Of course, they're pretty opportunistic, so they'll catch like amphibians or small birds in the grass as well, but they're definitely not like kind of bird hunting forest specialists like a lot of the other accipiters are. And so this study really clarified the actual relationships between all these different like accipiter groups, as well as their relationships to the harriers and other similar raptors. And so as it turns out, based on the phylogeny that they found, the authors propose that the genus Accipiter has to be split up into multiple genera to reflect these new relationships, unless we want to consider the harriers members of Accipiter too, which doesn't seem ideal because they otherwise seem so different. I guess if you are in the United States or Canada, the most familiar accipiter hawks you would get would be things like Cooper's hawk and the sharp-shinned hawks. And so the sharp-shinned hawk still remains in the genus Accipiter under this new phylogeny, but the Cooper's hawk does not. So the Cooper's hawk instead is reclassified in the genus Astor, alongside the American goshawk, which is like a bigger but less commonly seen accipiter, as well as the Eurasian goshawk as well, which is very similar to the American goshawk. In fact, they used to be considered the same species. Over here in the UK, our most familiar accipiter is the Eurasian sparrowhawk, which also remains in the genus accipiter. But there are some other types of accipiter hawks, quote unquote, from around other parts of the world that have been reclassified into further more genera. So, for example, some of them got classified in the genus Tachyspiza. A lot of the accipiter hawks that I can see, or at least have a chance of seeing, in Taiwan and other parts of Eastern and Southeast Asia were reclassified in the genus Tachyspiza. There's a species in Taiwan called the crested goshawk, reclassified into the genus Lophospiza. And so essentially we've had like this big breakup of the genus accipiter. And so if you look at like bird databases nowadays and look up your favorite accipiter hawks, you might find that they're no longer in the genus accipiter anymore. And why is that? Well, it's because of this new study. So yeah, I think this is really exciting. I know like a lot of birders or people who are casually interested in ornithology are often very frustrated by how we often change the scientific names like that. But it really reflects a like kind of improved understanding regarding the evolutionary history and relationships of these birds. And I think that is all of the news that I had prepared for now. So we can go on to your studies then.
Absolutely. So I'll jump right into mine. So let's see. Yeah, like I said, I have picked papers from during our hiatus period to highlight. So anytime from September to December that caught my attention or that were very fascinating and I'd love to share with everybody. So over here on the left, this phylogeny here. So this paper comes from Hans B. Puschel and colleagues from September of 2024. And this provides a dental-based phylogeny of the litopterns and their relatives. Now, these are the so-called South American native ungulates, or sanyus, which are a diverse group of hoofed mammals that had much of the continent themselves prior to around 2.8 million years ago, when arrivals from the north supplemented them. As such, there are none left today, and their relationship to each other and to other placental mammals has been a mystery for quite some time. Recent work indicates that at least some of these animals form a sister group to the perissodactyls. These are the odd-toed hoof mammals. Think about horses, rhinos, and tapirs. But questions have remained as to whether all of the South American native ungulates are related to each other. So the results from the dentition phylogeny, and that includes all of the oldest known members of each of the respective groups that have been included within this assemblage, indicate a very cautionary yes, and are hypothesized as having descended from a common ancestor at least 65.9 million years ago that seems to have entered the continent from the north and was perhaps related to the North American myoclanids, although evidence for eutherians in this part of the world at that time is currently lacking. As well, for those getting into the nitty-gritty of it, the team found that some traditional Sanyu groups, like the Didylodontids and the Protolipternids, were not monophyletic groups, but consisted of a number of successive clades that lead up to the other major Sanyu lineages. So I guess basal, if you like to use that term. So over here on the right, then, we have a paper now from Jessica I. Cerezo-Roman and colleagues from September of 2024, and with a huge shift in subjects from South American paleontology to classical antiquity. So the Carthaginians, or the Punics, which were a Phoenician colony turned empire that existed between circa 800 to 146 BC on the North African coast, were long an unthreatened power in the Mediterranean before the Greeks and soon the Romans began to contest them over territories. According to the traditional histories written by the Greeks, during an invasion in 310 BC under Agathocles of Syracuse, known as the Battle of White Tunis, the fighting turned chaotic as the Greek tyrant burned down his own ships to keep his own soldiers on the battlefield and encourage them to fight. The panicked Carthaginians, in utter desperation for this first ever threatening of the city, which they had never dealt with before, were said to have turned to child sacrifice in the hopes of appeasing angry gods to save the city. Since that time, we have inherited writings from historians like Plutarch and Diodorus about Punic sacrifice of children, which the Greeks must have reflected an archaic society with practices they themselves had long abandoned since the times immortalized by Homer. For modern archaeologists, remains of buried urns within temple sanctuaries called tophets have been unearthed, which do indeed contain the remains of children that were cremated, found alongside ritual objects like incense burners, musical instruments, and masks. So, are these the fabled sacrifices the Greeks wrote about? Well, no, says the team behind this paper, at least, corroborating some earlier reports. Many of the remains have come from children who were stillborn or died from health complications like anemia and scurvy. You can see some of that specific evidence in the two bone fragments here at the right. This physical evidence indicates that life for children, and no doubt many of the adults, was actually extremely difficult in Carthage, and there was little ready access to traditional foods, clean air, and proper sanitation. In the remains analyzed by the team, there weren't any that showed signs of violent trauma that would be associated with human sacrifice. It seems, at least, that these Punic burials were more associated with ceremonial rituals for a careful funerary treatment. To quote the paper itself, if child sacrifice was practiced at Zaida, which is the site analyzed by the paper, then it is possible that sick children could have been sacrificed preferentially over healthy children, thereby introducing bias into our data. But conclusive evidence for sacrifice has not yet been recovered. So let's move to the next slide then for my final three papers here. This next one comes from Francesca Pencaldi and colleagues from November 2024 here on the left, showing some more neat behaviors by orcas, or killer whales. While I've been intrigued to see many observational reports over the years of these giant dolphins taking down enormous prey like blue whales,
Hmm.
as had long been noted by sailors and biologists alike, this particular paper was an honest surprise to me. The team have documented 4 different cases of orcas hunting whale sharks, which are the
Hmm.
largest fish in the ocean, within the Gulf of California between the years 2018 and last year. A taste for large sharks like these has been known since the 1990s, but reports have been lacking, so this is some of the most important and no doubt the best documented evidence we have so far. And what's even more remarkable is that all of these cases appear to be linked. In 3 of the 4 hunting events, an adult male orca named Moctezuma was seen participating with the other whales. They would ram the whale sharks, turn them upside down, and then target the pelvic fins and livers, all using coordinated methods to bring down these fish. But on the 4th encounter, some of the adult female orcas involved were also associated with Moctezuma in some way, even if he wasn't there participating in that specific hunt. And so the team speculates that we may be dealing with an orca community that specializes in hunting whale sharks and other giant oceanic sharks and rays like mantas,
Hmm.
though more needs to be seen about that. Then over on the top right is a paper by Zikun Wang and colleagues from November of 2024, taking us back in time to the early Cambrian period. Now, the fossil record of organisms settling and colonizing land environments has been growing steadily over the years, and we've slowly gotten a more complete picture of the sequence of events that led to terrestrial ecosystems as we know them. It has been known for some time that prior to full-scale movement of plants and animals onto the land, organisms seem to have swam and crawled in so-called subaerial wet substrates. Think about tidal flats or mud flats located between the waterways and the land. Here, the team analyzed and showcased a series of trace fossils from different formations across the early Cambrian record and into the Ordovician period, so starting at 529 million years ago and going forward, that were revealed to show evidence of mollusk-like organisms that had moved at a snail's pace across the sand and lay exposed for several minutes at a time. So seemingly they were foraging for food and depositing waste materials. Now, the existence of such organisms so early in time, compared to the later records of seashore and land invertebrates and plants, suggests that organisms like these may have played a key role in the foundations of the types of habitats used by these so-called transitional forms between aquatic and terrestrial organisms. Now, my last paper here on the bottom right is from Connor Rossi and colleagues from October of 2024, and it deals with the aurochs, Bos primigenius, which is the ancestor of all domestic cattle, but is extinct in its wild form today. As has been done for several of our livestock and their progenitors, this study sequenced ancient genomes to better understand the population history of the aurochs across Eurasia and North Africa. So they sampled 38 genomes, and the team was able to tell a brief outline of this species. So after essentially originating in Eurasia and making an early entry into Europe by 650,000 years ago, the aurochs had started to diversify into three distinct populations between a period of 300 and 166,000 years ago. One in North Asia, one in South Asia, which was ancestral to the Indocene zebu, one in Southwest Asia, and then as well, of course, the ones that had stayed in Europe. But around that time, the early European populations seem to have been gradually replaced by southern expansions in all except a few refugia, where they retained a fair genetic diversity. After the end of the last ice age, around 11,000 years ago, populations mixed again across Eurasia. But it seems that during a narrow window, as indicated by the ancient genomes, humans in Southwest Asia had selected just a few aurochs and successfully domesticated them. And this suggests that that particular process for this species was not a gradual one, but rather a sudden and perhaps even calculated approach, given historical reports of how dangerous wild cattle can be. From there, domestic livestock spread across Eurasia and North Africa, and it appears that it was mainly through matings between wild males and domesticated females that much of our cattle diversity can be explained today. And so that's quite a diverse range of papers, but I thought each of them was fascinating in their own way. And I wanted to share them all with you today as sort of my highlights for the end of the 2024 year. That's about it for me. Did you have any comments at all about any of my papers at all?
I think you made a very excellent and varied selection of studies to talk about. Some of them I hadn't really looked too deeply into, so glad you highlighted them so I can take a second look.
Absolutely. And likewise on your end, too. You picked some very great papers. Um, it's kind of fun seeing the Diatryma is back paper because I'm just getting deja vu from the Brontosaurus paper from many years
Oh
ago.
yeah.
Um, and I'm going to be very curious about what sort of pushback, if any, there's going to be because even now there's still some researchers who question the Brontosaurus study and
Yeah.
think that it all is a Patasaurus at the end of the day. So I look forward to keeping up with that. Absolutely. Um, but yes, my friends, that is it for our episode today. Kind of a mixed bag of things that we wanted to cover, but in essence, we're looking into 2025 with different expectations, and we love doing the show, and we want to keep doing the show. It's a great passion of mine to be able to look up all of the things that fascinate me about our natural world and human history, and get to share them with you all here. And we want to keep doing that. And if we can do it in a way that is easier for all of us and for all of you, then that's all the more better. So we look forward to this new year with high hopes and hopefully a lot of really fun papers and hopefully a lot more updates in the near future. I know a big thing I'd like to do is continue working on Humanity a Prologue Season 2, actually get moving forward with it and focus more on it and get more of those episodes out because the field of paleoanthropology and anthropology as a whole is moving very fast and got to get some of this stuff out there before it changes completely again and then we're back to square one with our update specials in that case. But I have some really fun ideas for this series and I can't wait to share them all with everyone.
I'm definitely looking forward to continuing the show, but kind of moderating my involvement, I guess, in how much investment I have in it. But we'll still be around. You're not getting rid of us just yet. You'll have plenty to look forward to.
Absolutely. Well, let's go on ahead then to our general acknowledgments and end credits. So on our next slide here, of course, again, we are on Patreon. That is patreon.com/timeclades. For those not in the know, Patreon is a website service where for donations of any monetary value, you can support content creators and, for example, help us continue our series and create new projects and expansions. We have tier lists, for example, that allow different access to behind the scenes content, updates, and previews of upcoming episodes, and things of that nature. Um, and you can also get shoutouts if you are so interested in. So, for example, on our tier that we have that allows you to get shoutouts, I want to thank my sister Julie and our friends Tristan, Frankish, and Val Denunzio for their support. It's always appreciated. We're also looking at our Patreon too to make it a little bit better and a little bit more feasible for our followers, considering that we had taken just a long break, and we want to make sure that whatever support we get goes back to everyone as well in a fair way. So we're going to look into that as well for sure. But moving on to our general acknowledgments, of course, we want to thank our good friends Henry and Alicia for their contributions to this series. Henry is responsible for the opening music that begins each episode, which is very wonderful. And of course, Alicia is responsible for the color scheme of Albert's Alvarezsaur avatar, cheery little fellow. Moving on, yeah, we're still on Twitter. We are at Time and Clades. As is usual, we usually use that site to post episodes when they premiere. But most likely, you're going to be following us on YouTube, of course, our YouTube page through Time and Clades. If you wish to like and subscribe, that's always appreciated. If you have any questions at all about our show, whether about the topics we covered on this episode or just anything at all, you have three ways to reach us. You can send us an email, timeandclades@gmail.com. You can tweet at us, or you can leave a YouTube comment and we'll respond in kind. Of course, the links in the description for all of our references and media coverage that we talked about today is available to check out. So go there for further information. Um, with that, at the moment, I know one immediate thing that we're looking forward to premiering very soon is our new lecture series by our friend Alari Patia, who had prepared a series on paleo art. And so we'll keep updates on that whenever we can.
Mm-hmm.
But it's looking like things are coming to a close for at least the first in that lecture series. So it might not be long to wait for more from us. But until then, thank you all so much for joining in. And here's to a happy new year and healthy and safe wishes for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And wish you all a very wonderful day.
Yeah, absolutely. Take care, everybody.